What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to The Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insight that you can use to improve your fantasy lineups. My name is Reese, a very warm welcome to you, and in today's video, we're going to discuss what the data suggests we should do going into Monza, and I want to talk you through a potentially risky strategy I'm using for my lineup that I believe is going to bank me some big points at the weekend. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company Play On that sponsors the game. If it's not already obvious to you from my spreadsheet, I'm a bit of a data nerd and I love Formula One. Formula One is my passion, so I figured why not try and build a community of other like-minded people here on YouTube. If that sounds good to you, stay tuned to the channel for all sorts of awesome fantasy content. And now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. I think the thing we need to address first is the grid penalties, because for me, the grid penalties have really simplified things this week. So far, there are 6 confirmed penalties. Both Red Bull drivers are taking penalties, Carlos is taking a penalty, then Lewis, Valtteri and Yuki are also all confirmed to be taking a penalty. And there is currently a question mark over Mick after he caused a red flag about halfway through FP2. So let's get into the penalties and see if any of the penalties make any of the drivers a hard pass for us amateur team principals this weekend. We're like 30 seconds into the video. I feel like I've already said the word penalty 1,000 times. Max has opted to take his 5th internal combustion engine of the season, which is 2 more than you're allowed, so the defending world champion has been hit with a 10th place penalty. In all honesty, after Max's dominant display at Spa, I don't think a 10th place penalty is going to stop the Flying Dutchman from being on the podium, so even with the penalty, I would say that Max is still a viable pick this weekend. In terms of qualifying strategies, Red Bull have also decided to hit Sergio with a penalty. I don't actually think they're making any changes to his car, they just want to make sure that Sergio is behind Max, so Sergio is also taking a 10th place penalty. And for me, that requires careful consideration. Mercedes said that Lewis was going to be starting from the back of the grid on Thursday after they opted to put a 4th engine into his car. I said this in my last video, but anyone who's picking Lewis when you can have Max for 0.2 million less is a madman. For me, the penalty means Lewis is not a viable pick this weekend. On to everyone's favourite punching bag, Ferrari have opted to avoid disappointing the Tifosi 2 laps into the race and instead opted to disappoint the Tifosi 2 whole days before lights out. Sainz is heading to the back of the grid to fit a new gearbox, which in my mind makes him a very risky pick. Could he carve his way through the field and maybe take a top 4 finish? Ferrari will probably tell him that's the plan on the radio, but I also expect they'll tell him they're moving to plan Q by lap 13, and so for me, Carlos is not a viable pick for Monza. Bottas is taking a 15th place grid penalty for adding some extra parts onto his car. And if you couple the penalty with his recent performance, Valtteri is, and I cannot emphasize this hard enough, a hard pass. Valtteri has now averaged 1 point per race over the last 7 races. And in the last 3 races, he has actually managed to score minus 19 points. I really like Valtteri Bottas. I think he's a great driver. I have a print of his naked ass laying in a river on the wall in my office. But if Valtteri is still in your team going into Monza, you need to remove him. There are now 3 drivers that cost less and consistently score more points than Valtteri. Hell, even Goat Tiffy is outscoring Valtteri at the moment. So if he's still in your lineup, the data suggests you get him out. Last but not least, it's Yuki. And I've seen conflicting reports about why Yuki is taking a penalty. Some sites are reporting that his penalty is for a new engine, and others are reporting that it's because he's been sent to the headmaster's office 1 too many times this year. Either way, Yuki is heading to the back of the grid. Yuki is currently P20 in the Fantasy Drivers' Championship and the Points Per Pound Championship. So Yuki's 46 points are quite literally the most expensive points your money can buy. It's a shame because after what looked like a possible spark of a comeback at Spa, the 12 points Yuki scored were immediately reduced to 9 from his performance at Zandvoort. I mentioned this in my last video, but if you remove his scores from Bahrain and the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, he has actually scored minus 3 points across 13 races. Year on year, he's also managed to score 17.9% less points after 15 races, and that is including his scores from Bahrain and Emilia Romagna. If Yuki is in your team, the data suggests you remove him, and if you're looking at him, the data suggests you look elsewhere. Let's talk about Mick for a second. I think if Mick takes a penalty, then Kevin is a good pick. Kevin managed to flip Mick and reclaim the lead in the teammate deltas at Zandvoort, and I'm confident that Kevin will be able to extend his 6-point lead over Mick if Mick takes a penalty. So what in recent weeks has been a nightmare decision that I would usually suggest you opt out of by selecting alternate drivers, this week I think Kevin is a safe pick and he could score you some really good points. If Mick takes the penalty. If he doesn't take the penalty, then again, it's a tough call and not one I will personally be making because I think I'm going to stick with Albon. Okay, so what am I thinking going into Monza? For me, Max's penalty is nothing to worry about, but Sergio's is. And I'm not confident Sergio will carve his way through the pack at the same pace I think Max will. Same logic applies to Carlos and the same applies to Lewis. They'll have some pace, but it won't be as easy for them as it will for Max. So potentially a controversial take, and stick with me, I don't think Red Bull, Ferrari or Mercedes are strong contenders for Monza. What I think I want to do with my team this week is bet on the drivers and run with Leclerc and Verstappen. But in order to do that, I'll need to go with a cheaper constructor to free up some budget for the driver market, and that is a risk. The constructor that I'm going to choose is Alpine. Alpine are on a great run at the moment. Fernando is killing the game, having scored at least 11 points in the last 10 races, and Esteban is averaging 18.4 points across the last 5 races. They're on a great run at the moment, and the results from both free practice sessions support the notion that Alpine will get a good haul of points at Monza. I don't expect this change will be permanent. I actually think I'll reverse it for Singapore, but for Monza, it's Red Bull out, Alpine in. Okay, my next 2 changes are really easy. Carlos out, Charles in, and Sergio out, Max in. Now, this is a big risk because it feels like I'm putting all of my eggs into 2 baskets, but if we can have a clean race, I think these 2 will bring me in a mountain of points. Now, am I worried that this will be the week they finally come together? After all, Max has shown us in the past that he's not afraid to park his Red Bull on the head of his championship rival going into the chicane. So yes, I do think it's a risk, but I think this week is a week where you can more confidently say Max or Charles will win, rather than the slightly higher level, a Red Bull or a Ferrari driver will win. Now yes, in 53% of the races this year, Max has won, and in 73% of the races this year, Max or Charles has won. So you could say, come on, that statement is true in 3 out of 4 races. But I think given the penalties, we can quite confidently say Monza is not going to be the 1 out of 4. Monza is more likely going to be one of the 1 out of 3. So swapping Red Bull out and saying it's not going to be a Red Bull driver, it's going to be Max. And if it's not Max, it's not going to be a Ferrari driver, it's going to be Charles, feels like a safe bet. Just to really bring this home, once you add Sergio and Carlos into the mix, a Red Bull or a Ferrari driver have won 93% of the races this year. The only non-Red Bull and non-Ferrari driver to win a race this year is Lewis, and that was at Canada where he clocked 48 points, beating Max by 4 points due to a 5-point qualifying streak he was on at the time. So where does that leave me? That leaves me with 3 out of 3 free transfers made. But I'm now sitting on 8.8 million in the bank, and that's a lot of spare cash. I could swap Albon out and put Lando in, but then I'm taking a 10-point penalty to get Lando in. Plus, Albon is looking competitive in the Williams. I could take Stroll out and put Lando in. The reason I say Lando is because Lando is on a qualifying streak, and it's hard to imagine Daniel is going to out-qualify Lando at Monza, even if he is going into the race as last year's winner. So the streak points for Lando feel like free points. Okay, so let's compare the drivers. Lando has beaten Lance by more than 10 points in 10 races this year, whereas he has only beaten Albon by 10 points in 5 races. However, the points delta between Lando and either driver plus 10 points to account for the penalty goes the other way, because Lando has outscored Lance by 32 points and Albon by 77 points. He beats Lance more often, but when he beats Albon, he beats him by a bigger margin. Usually, I would say the results from free practice are noise, but on this occasion, I'm actually going to let the results from free practice drive my decision, and Albon has beaten Lance in both sessions. Lance and Alex both beat Lando in FP2, which kind of completely undermines this whole transfer, but I'm going to overlook that and say the streak points are a given. Therefore, this transfer is logical. Now, the thing I have been thinking about a lot is, do I use my wild card to offset the penalty? And after a lot of back and forthing in my mind, I have decided that using my wildcard to make the transfer for free is the right thing to do, because for the next race, I'm expecting I want to swap Alpine out and put Red Bull back. So that's 1. Then Max out and Sergio back, so that's 2. And then in order to make it work financially, I will probably be forced to bin Lando and put Lance back in. So the 2 drivers I'm expecting to stick with going forward are Leclerc and Fernando. Therefore, the wildcard will not be needed next week to get back to my more rounded lineup. Okay, so for me, I'm running with Max, who even with the penalty, I'm still expecting will score at least 41 points. Then it's Leclerc, who I'm expecting to get me 56 points because Leclerc is going to be my turbo driver. I'm expecting Fernando to add 20 points to the bag based on his average since Spain, and I'm hoping Lando will add another 20 with his season average of 15 plus his 5-point streak if he beats Daniel. Then, if Albon can add double digits, say 10 points, I'll be very happy. Over the last 4 races, Alpine have averaged 30 points per race, so I'd like to think that will pay dividends. So for Monza, I'm targeting 177 points. In terms of some other drivers that the data suggests should be in the mix, of course we have Esteban. The momentum is with Fernando at the moment, but Esteban is currently outscoring his season average of 15.5 points by 3.4 points over the last 5 races. So season average or current average, Esteban is a great pick. George, of course. George missed out on his first win of the season last week by 4 seconds on the track, but only 1 single point in the fantasy classification separated George and Max. Excluding Silverstone, George has scored at least 26 points in every single race this year, and last week he would have added 53 points to your bank. I could run with George instead of Max, but then I'm left with the same problem as before, and that is surplus cash. Plus, I think Max beats George this weekend, no issue. So for me, Max is the pick, but George is solid, and if I could get him in, I would. To be fair, I did toy with Max, Leclerc and George as my front row, with then Fernando and K-Mag as my reserves, but then I'm forced to pick Williams as my constructor. And to be fair to Williams, they did win points per pound at Zandvoort, so this lineup is a good lineup. But comparing the points, let's say 41 for Max, 56 for Charles and 20 for Fernando, then if we say 30 for George and then only 7 for K-Mag, which once you add Williams in, let's say they have an average week and lock you in 9 points, that only gets you to 163. So that's 8% less than the other lineup. I'd love to have George because I'd love to see George take his first win of the season this weekend, given the sad news about the Queen passing away. I think hearing the national anthem this weekend would mean a lot to the fans, but I don't see it happening. Unless Max and Charles do collide at the chicane, then I do think George would swoop in for the win. Constructors, as I said earlier, I think you need to be careful with the top 3. If you are going to go with one of the top 3, then I think it should be Red Bull because their penalties are the least severe and their car is the most dominant. Plus, I'm sure Ferrari probably have an in case of emergency break glass plan waiting in the wings to screw one of their drivers. If you want to spend big money on your constructor and you're looking at Mercedes, surely Lewis's penalty has to make you think, I'll put 2 million back in the bank and just go with the energy drink boys instead. Okay, I think that will do it for this video. I'm heading to my parents today to watch quali with my dad and my little brother. Thank you for taking a few minutes out of your Saturday morning to listen to me talk about my team. I really appreciate your time. I hope this video helps you make some decisions with your fantasy lineup. If you have any questions or want to see something specific, let me know in the comments. I'm going to add a new view to the next team selection video, which will rank the drivers and put them into a tier list, mainly to try and identify the clear passes week to week, because picking 5 drivers from a list of 20 isn't easy. But if you can reduce that down to picking 5 out of say 14, then that's not as bad. I've also got something really cool in the works that I'm going to share with you next Saturday, which tries to identify the most consistent drivers. So anyone that wants to minimize risk in the final 6 races, we have some useful data on the way to help you make that decision. Have a great day ahead, and I'll see you on Tuesday for the Fantasy Race Report.